Good afternoon, everyone. This is on, right? Yeah. Thank you for joining us. My name is Denise Sianovich. I'm the managing director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. Alejandro Werner, our director, is on his way here, but given the icy roads, uh, it's been hard to find parking. So he's asked me to go ahead and introduce Ning, our guest speaker today, who's going to present her latest book. Uh, Ning Leng is an assistant professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Her research examines how non-democratic institutions create unintended consequences in state business relations and development outcomes, including public service provision, infrastructure building, and environment policy making. Her area of focus is China. Her research is supported by the National Science Foundation, the Chiang Ching-kuo Foundation, the Institute for Human Studies, and various other research grants. I must add that Ning has been involved with us because we are the Americas Institute, uh, because she has developed a recent interest in looking at China's presence in Latin America. And has done very interesting research there. We've had several conversations on this. And as you know, China presence in Latin America has become increasingly important for this country's foreign policy in the hemisphere as well. So it's of crucial importance to understand China's role in the region, to understand how the U.S. is developing their foreign policy towards the Western Hemisphere. So thank you so much, Ning, for giving us insights on how China operates through their business sector. I think it's of incredible importance for anyone interested in foreign policy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Denise, for the very generous introduction. And thank you, the Americas Institute, for inviting me. And I must say, this book is very much the foundation of my current second book project, which is on Chinese companies when they move outside of China, when they enter South America. How do they perform? And what is their relationship with the states in Latin America? And that research is generously sponsored by the Americas Institute. So it's my great pleasure to be here to tell you a little bit about the first book on how Chinese business operate in China and what their relationship with the Chinese government is like. So the background of this talk is based on these consensus, shall we say, that it's often argued that the Chinese state and the private sector has found a stable and mutually beneficial way to coexist. Ever since the 1980s, right, China's economic reform started in 1978, we saw that both the state and the business have been making a lot of efforts to create a beneficial business environment for investment. So on the state side, they had launched legal reforms. They do not have rule of law yet, but they do have rule by law, and they have greatly improved legal environment for business in China. We also saw the Chinese party state made salient efforts to streamline bureaucratic processes for business, applying for licenses, tax, etc. They have standardized policy enforcement across local governments in China regarding business. The central government also has reined in the tax authority of local Chinese governments and restricted local protectionism of local firms in different Chinese cities and provinces. And of course, the party state has launched anti-corruption campaigns, which should be able to improve business environment. And on the business side, we also saw a lot of efforts. One of them is the private sector in China has learned to build political ties with important government figures. They started to join the party. Today, based on some estimates, 41% of all of the private entrepreneurs in China are part of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. The private entrepreneurs also have been joining government bodies and representative institutions like the People's Congress of China, political consultation bodies, etc., to lobby to get information firsthand to have a closer relationship with the Chinese government. The business in China also form business alliances and coalitions among themselves to further lobby and fight for a favorable business environment. And they have been contributing to CCP causes in recent years. They donated a lot of money to, for example, poverty alleviation campaign of the CCP. That being said, though, we have this puzzling phenomenon, which is every once in a while, we do see the Chinese state crack down on the private sector. So most recently, if I name some, show you some Chinese news article headlines, we will see that China's year of crackdown started in 2021, and Chinese government has been cracking down on many sectors, tech, tutoring, finance, you name it. And famous entrepreneurs, Jack Ma and these people listed here, Xiao Jianhua, Wu Xiaohui, got arrested. And so people started to wonder, we see a lot of questions floating around and asking, is the CCP now changing its attitude towards the private sector? And some China watchers would say this very much reflects a heightened risk under political centralization of Xi. However, meanwhile, we still see the Chinese party state comes out consistently stating that we're not going against the entire private economy. We're trying to reshape it. We're not trying to choke it. And Xi Jinping himself, almost every year, ever since 2018, will come out, have a public speech or meet with leading private entrepreneurs in China and was reassured that the party state very much needs your private economy in this market economy. And so if we take a step back, we will notice that this phenomenon, in fact, is nothing new. It has been going on ever since China's economic reform. State crackdown on the private economy was very much part of China's political economy model. Before 1993, there were two waves of crackdown. They were indiscriminate on the private economy. So 1980s, when the private economy first started to grow into scale, the CCP got very concerned. They're like, how come suddenly we have these very rich and organized entrepreneurs, right? What if they have the power to stage a regime change? And then so they cracked down on these private entrepreneurs nationwide across sectors and then realized that the economy is really going backwards if we do this. So 1984, they ended it. And then 1989, it happened again after the Tiananmen Square student protest. CCP concluded that the students were sponsored by private entrepreneurs in China. So see, capitalists, they really try to, subvert the regime. So a second wave of crackdown began in 1990, again indiscriminate across sectors, across localities. Both of these waves were guided by Deng Xiaoping himself, the engineer of China's economic reform. 1992, CCP learned its lesson and realized that we really cannot do this to the entire private sector. Economy is immediately going backwards and declining. So in 1993, CCP wrote this into Chinese constitution that says private sector is very much part of China's socialist market economy. Now, after 1993, this does not mean the party state stopped on cracking down on the private sector. It has changed its way of doing it. Basically, based on my data collection, after 1993, the crackdown shows a sectoral pattern. And I've collected at least over 25 sectors which have experienced state crackdown. And by crackdown encroachment, I'm talking about phenomenon like forced shareholder sales, forced mergers and acquisitions with state-owned enterprise SOEs, or local governments in China, arrest of private entrepreneurs, shutdown of specific private companies, or shutdown of the entire sector. So these are what I mean by encroachment. And this very much informs my research question for this book, which is, when and where does the Chinese party state encroach into the private sector? And why would they do that at a certain point with a certain sector? Little bit preview of the finding of the book. In the classic theory of nationalization, for example, we know the state would encroach, shall we say, or nationalize a sector for a few reasons. If these sectors are economically very profitable, if these sectors are strategically important, such as electricity and important mining resources, right? And if these sectors have a monopoly issue where the government has difficulty in writing complete contracts, these are the classical explanations. What I find is that when a sector harbors political assets or political capital that the state could utilize, it's also a recent precursor of state encroachment. So I call this to be politicization of firms. When the state wants to utilize political capital in the sector to politicize the sector. And politicization of business, if I borrow from Boyko, Schleifer, and Vishny, would be have business pressured or bribed into bring their objectives in line with those of the politicians. So politicization of business would be a reason of state encroachment. And what does the party state want from these sectors? Why would they politicize them? There are some very obvious political services that the sector could provide to a state that we know, and these are probably universal. So for one, there is office buying. Entrepreneurs have money. They could help officials to bribe the officials' bosses to get promotion. We know the business always, provide opportunity for employment, particularly in economic downturn, right? You could ask business, traditionally state-owned enterprise, to hire more people than they need to stabilize the labor market. You will have business, particularly internet, AI, right, to monitor and survey your citizenry. These are obvious political services. In my book, I find two more political services that the Chinese party state ask of their business, which has so far been quite under the radar. One of them is to have business contribute to what I call visibility projects. These are projects to help individual officials promote, and I'll give you some specific examples. And the second political service they ask of the companies is societal control in the most direct sense, beyond monitoring and surveillance, but really have the business go on the ground to appease or suppress the public when controversial projects are needed. And when politicization happens in any sector, it will change state-business relations. Now, there is a subtle difference here. If the political services is asked of specific and few companies, then in nature, these political services could be like a bribe that the business pays the state. In that case, political services could improve state-business relations. However, if political services is asked, demanded of an entire sector or an entire locality, it is in nature like a regulation. When it's that case, you will see state-business relations decline. It's definitely bad news for the business, and I'll show you all of these. A little bit of roadmap before I go into details. I'll tell you a little bit about research design. I'll introduce the political services, focusing on visibility projects. It's more fun. And then I'll give you some concluding thoughts. So first of all, how do I operationalize my research question? I have chosen the strictest way to measure state encroachment, which is deprivatization of an entire sector. This will be a process initiated, announced by the Chinese state at a local level that says it is time to have the sector come back to state control. This will be a sector that was privatized. So the most extreme form, state encroachment. I leverage several variations. One of them is sectoral. So I noticed that in these two very mundane food soldier sectors, there will be the urban bus, there will be waste incineration. Both of them were called to supply political services. However, we saw that in the urban bus sector, once the state asked them to provide political services, private sector started to decline rapidly in this sector. At the peak, what you're seeing here is that at around 2006, more than 81% of all Chinese cities have the sector open to the private business. And that is no longer the case. Today, at 2019, we will see under 20% of Chinese cities still have private services in the sector. But the opposite is true. For waste treatment, particularly in waste incineration, private sector steadily grew in the sector. I also leverage local variation within each sector and temporal variation of when deprivatization happened to understand when and where does the state encroach into a sector and why. And this is sources of evidence. I've done fieldwork in 15 Chinese cities between 2015 and 2019. The longest leg of fieldwork was 18 months at a time. And that allowed me to interview with over 200 government officials and business people. With many of them, I met them for over more than twice. And then I also collected a regional city level database and conduct quantitative analysis to show patterns. So now that being said, let me tell you a little bit about the first political service, visibility projects. Before I tell you what it is, let me show you what they look like. This is a wastewater treatment plant in a southwest Chinese city. What we're seeing on this photo is 20 sediment tanks. In reality, though, this wastewater treatment plant is the third one built in this small city of less than 1,600,000 people. And this wastewater treatment plant has a capacity that is 5 times over what it needs to do. And now considering that a wastewater treatment plant has on average a 40-year lifespan, that will mean throughout the lifespan of this wastewater treatment plant, it will never make a profit. It will be at a loss forever, 5 times over capacity. This is built by a private company, but the scale of the wastewater treatment plant was decided by the local city government. This is a waste incineration plant that we're looking at here. This is a very fancy, modern, and large waste incineration plant. In fact, they hired a famous European designer studio to design the exterior of it. The plant is supposed to incorporate both incineration and recycling. So you're supposed to recycle before you burn the rest of the garbage. However, once you get into this incineration plant, you will notice that it is in fact missing the solid waste separation facilities, meaning paper, glass, plastic, and metal would all be put together, and then they would just be burned directly. There was no recycling to speak of. Also built by a private company. This is an interesting urban planning example. So this will be Qingdao City in northern China. In 2006, they had a new mayor. This was a very ambitious mayor, and he had this urban planning idea. Now, Qingdao City is a city that harbors a bay, and there are two areas on two ends of the bay inlet, right, that had difficulty travel to each other. They will have to drive across the entire bay to reach the other end. So this new ambitious mayor said, well, we got to connect these two dots on the opposite end of the bay. How do you do that? There are two ways to go about this. One, you build a bridge over the water to connect these 2 points, right? And second, you build an undersea tunnel. Now, all of the engineers and experts told this mayor that you should build a tunnel. Do not build a bridge. Here are the reasons. This is a northern city, right? For months in the winter, there will be ice, snow, wind, and nobody will use the bridge. It's going to be unstable. Second, this is one of the most important commercial ports in China. The bridge cannot be right there sitting at the inlet. It has to be moved inside into the bay. That will make it saliently longer, but then the ships will be allowed into the port, right? When you make such a long bridge, it's gonna be really expensive in construction, it's expensive in maintenance, and there will be even less time people can use in the winter because the bridge will shake in the winter. So everybody says you should build a tunnel. It could be right there in the inlet, shortest distance, not affected by weather. The mayor said, no, I want a bridge because nobody could see a tunnel. If I build a tunnel, nobody would know I had this great urban planning, competence. But after the bridge was built, very quickly, he realized everybody else was right. So let's also build a tunnel. So now the city has both a bridge and a tunnel. The bridge cost over 2 billion in US dollars. The bridge was $800 million. And the bridge is not used much in the end, exactly as everybody predicted. So what are visibility projects? These are projects that prioritize appearance and scale over practicality, cost effectiveness, and sustainability. The opposite of them will be invisible projects. For example, sewer pipes underground, recycling separation facilities in an incineration plant. The tunnel, right? Those will be invisible projects. The goal of these projects, they're not built to really, target primarily a bottom-up demand. The goal of them is to enhance the project initiator's political visibility and reputation in the system in the hope of career advancement. So now let's take a step back and think about why do Chinese officials need to have visibility projects? We know this is an authoritarian state with ingenious design in incentivizing their officials to do what the party state wants them to do. There actually had been argued a rigorous system to evaluate all of the officials. Now, here's what's wrong with the evaluation system in China and why this pushes Chinese government officials to pursue visibility projects. The core of evaluating any Chinese local leader are twofold. One of them, and the most important criteria, is loyalty. This is a very vague concept, right? It basically is the party state tells these party officials and say, are you loyal, right? But what is loyalty? It basically comes down to guessing what the party state wants you to do and making sure that you are not doing things that the party state does not want you to do. It's so vague, it's full of guessing, and it makes people very anxious because it's hard to gauge, am I being loyal? Second component of the evaluation is competence. Now, competence, the CCP has been using a quantitative target system to incentivize people to reach policy targets of the Communist Party. And the evaluation system will look like this, what you're seeing on the screen right now. It will comprise of over 100 policy targets, such as this should be a GDP growth rate next year. This should be an unemployment rate next year. Quantitative, go do it. A year comes in, we're going to see how well you are doing on all of the quantitative evaluation targets. Now, any Chinese local leader has to do a great job, excel at both of loyalty and competence to get promoted. But this is the issue when you try to combine loyalty and competence. First problem comes from evaluating people's ability to govern with purely quantitative targets. This will be a universal issue. You use quantitative targets, that will mean everybody will just game to make the number pretty. And there are many ways that you can game your number. So giving you an example of a sector I'm familiar with, wastewater treatment, right? Chinese government says, we want a clean river. We want this country to be really clean. How do we do it? We're going to tell you your wastewater treatment rate of all the sewer has to be over 86%. How do you go about it as a local official? When the evaluation window comes, you put a real-time detector into water, you really monitor and enforce water quality very well for a week. You're going to show 86%. You don't need to do that every day. There are many ways to game these quantitative targets. And so we have a lot of research showing that this evaluation system of competence suffers from moral hazard gaming and data fabrication. And now coming down to loyalty. As we mentioned before, How do we measure loyalty? This is really vague measure. So Chinese government officials, when they are subject to both competence and loyalty, they're really concerned. They're not sure what they should do. They look at the competence evaluation. They say everybody could game their number. Everybody's going to have pretty numbers. Nobody could stand out, right? They look at loyalty. They are not sure. What do our boss want us to do or not to do? So they got into the state of high anxiety. So by the way, I've interviewed over 100 government officials. I always thought academia is a very, high anxiety environment until I saw Chinese government officials. I'm like, this induces high level of anxiety. And so these are quotes. The first quote, a provincial government official said, the evaluation system is serious, but there is a lot of art in making your numbers pretty. It is art. And the second one says, why do you think Buddhism and fortune telling are so popular among Chinese officials? So by the way, fortune telling is one of those growing industries in China right now. A good fortune teller gets paid a lot, and they usually have a clientele mixed of Chinese government officials and Chinese business people, two groups that are suffering from high anxiety about their future. And so when you have this uncertainty about how can you get ahead in this system combining loyalty and competence, local government officials who are ambitious then go into the mode of hyper competition in a very narrow area. So they engage in patron-client relations. We have literature showing this, right? There will be office buying. They will sing praises of their bosses on TV, that kind of behavior. But they also try to show competence beyond the formal system in a political safe way. So here we're talking about they understand there is a dictator's trade-off. They look around and they say, how can we stand out beyond this quantitative evaluation system to show that we're not only competent, but we're the most competent? We're going to launch visibility projects. These visibility projects are going to show that we can build scale, we can make an impression, we're going to have public projects much grander than what our neighbor mayors and neighbor provinces could do. And better yet, because visibility projects will always concentrate in areas that Beijing is trying to have a policy directive in. For example, Beijing now is turning its attention to AI. All of a sudden, you will see all of the local government officials in China are trying to build visibility projects in the area of AI. And I'll show you an example to show that we are loyal. We are only doing what Beijing wants us to do. And then we stress the scale, we stress the look of these projects to tell them we're competent, we can deliver. So this is why they need to go beyond the formal system to build visibility projects. 4 features of these projects before I show you more examples. First one, they have to be extra effort, as we mentioned, beyond job requirements. You're doing something that others are not necessarily doing, and you're doing them in a larger scale than anyone else. Second is, you can't do it anywhere. This is a party-state system that requires loyalty. You must have visibility projects in sectors that are approved by the Communist Party. So visibility projects are going to be concentrated in sectors with ambiguous rather than well-defined policy directives that allows creativity of the local government officials. It prioritizes top-down demands over bottom-up demands. Now, in China, we know that top-down demands are most important. Sometimes they're consistent with bottom-up demands, right? That does happen, but sometimes they're not consistent for several reasons. One is simply, if the party state wants something that does not, conform to local interest, the party state will still push for it for political reasons, economic reasons. And two, China is a huge country. It is not homogeneous. Sometimes the top-down demand works for some localities, but not all of them. So a lot of the times we will see top-down demand and bottom-up demands do not match each other. Now, in this kind of scenario, if a project still shows up that stresses its look and scale, most likely that will be a visibility project. And the last one is ex post criteria. These projects are usually quickly launched and short-lived. Quickly launched because, again, this is an authoritarian system. Beijing doesn't trust local officials. They don't want to have local lords from forming. If you put an official at a locality for too long, they're going to form their local network. They might have the power to defy Beijing's command. So China has this institutional arrangement of reposting Chinese officials. My data shows that every party secretary, #1 guy in any Chinese locality, has an average tenure of 3.5 years. Every mayor of a Chinese city has an average tenure of 2.9 years. Now imagine you come to the post, you're expecting to be reposted after 3 years. What are you going to do? You're going to quickly launch visibility projects to seize that promotion window. And then these projects will be short-lived because what happens after you get reposted, your successor have no incentive to maintain them. They cannot get credit from them, right? They will start their own projects. So these projects are usually short-lived as well. Now let's look at more examples. Some visibility projects are entertaining. They are a little bit costly, but they're not too bad. So this is a solar farm. It's huge. It's 248 acres, and it's in the shape of a giant panda. So if you're the provincial leader, if you ride a helicopter, look down from the sky, this will impress you. So that's a visibility project. That's fine. It's entertaining, right? Extra cost is minimal. This is a culture center. Now, this is a Chinese city who is very famous for aquaculture, and they're particularly famous for this delicious crab. And so one year, 2017, their city leader decided that we must show the province we're doing great in the crab industry. How do we show that? We're going to build a culture center in the vivid shape, color, and texture of a crab. So this is the culture center, and it's so fine. These are like hairs, stainless steel. It's really well done. However, the leader, the upper level leader really didn't like the crab building. So within a year, it was demolished. So this will be 13 million renminbi going to waste. Sometimes visibility projects, so this is where we talk about demands, right? They have damaging results. What we're looking at here is a forestation project. China had this issue of desertification, and Beijing understood this. They say we must prevent the desert from encroaching from northwest China into northeast China. So Beijing told the local government officials, you have to plant stuff, right, to prevent desertification. Now the issue is, what do you plant? In more than one locality, local officials decided they are not going with local desert plants, which will be crawling bushes, right? Crawling bushes and all of these, these plants are going to be brown, they're low growth, they're just not impressive. So local government official says, we want trees, and we want only trees. Now, what kind of trees? Poplar. Why poplar? This is the fastest growing trees in the world. Within 2 years, it will reach almost adult size and give you very impressive forest. But there's an issue of planting only poplar. One, you can't do monoculture with this tree. It will make it very vulnerable to pest and disease. They're more likely to die. And second, poplar, after 4 to 5 years, will be suitable for desert, no doubt about it. But until then, they need a lot of water. You need irrigation to keep them grow. But this is desert, right? Where does water come from? So here, these are all, by the way, publicized by CCP themselves. They were mad at this project. A local government official says, poplar and only poplar. They had this forest. 2.5 years later, this official got promoted and reposted. Successor came in, no interest in maintaining the poplar forest. So this is what happened after 5 years. The entire forest was gone, thanks to pest in this case. So that is when visibility projects could go really wrong. And here is to show trend. They have trends. So for example, right now, the trend will be in all the tech sector, robotics, etc. Now, robotics as an industry is most suitable, right? Where you have enough talent, highly educated engineers and scientists, you will have a logistics network, right? So in China, robotics industry naturally showed up on the southeast coastal area. But what do you do as an official in inland China? In this case, southwest. You don't have either of these conditions. You still want to show Beijing that we're competent and we're loyal. We're going to push for robotics for promotion. You build a robot park. Now, this is the largest transformer statue in the world that you could see. If you look at where people will enter this robot park, those are the gates. They're puny, right? You can see how big this transformer is. The whole purpose of this park is that this shows our intention to have a robotics industry. Eventually, the hope is, they told Beijing, we're going to have robotics industry come in to populate this park and will become a robotics center in Southwest China. So these are kind of the visibility projects that you will see in China. And it has a sectoral pattern because of what Beijing is focusing on. Now, this is a book about state business relations, right? So what is the role of firms in all of this? It turns out a lot of these projects, not all of them, a lot of these projects are paid by business. And the reason is local government officials, they want to claim credit by doing these extra things, but they also understand that what if these projects do not work? They don't want to share the extra blame that you're wasting fiscal resource, taxpayer money on these projects. So they will go to the firms that they're familiar with or they have power over, and they will say, you build these projects for us. Now, the cost of visibility projects are naturally, right, unaffordable to business because these are cost on exterior, on the look. They are not really building on adding to efficiency or productivity of a business. So they come across, against business interest. It's very difficult for business to afford. So business and state go into negotiation mode at first, depending on whether the business actually have bargaining power. In some cases, they simply don't. When these business visibility projects show up in a sectoral, like it requires all of the companies in the sector to obey in a regulation manner. So this is the case of urban buses. I'm going to show you what happened in this sector. The bus sector was ignored for the longest time by Chinese local officials until 2002. Now, the local officials, so China privatized its bus sector back in 1990s because it cost too much money, right, to fiscal expenditure. Privatize it. 2002, this sector came back to the attention of local government officials. They're like, Beijing suddenly have this new environmental initiative, which says we need clean air. How can we show Beijing that we are pushing for clean air? One way they did it is to look at the bus sector and they say, we're going to show Beijing we're discouraging citizens of using private vehicles. We'll tell Beijing that citizens are now taking buses. That's going to improve air. Absolutely true. But how do you go about it? Again, many visibility projects started to rise with their purpose not really improving air quality, but just to signal to Beijing that they're doing something for public to improve air quality. 3 types of them in the bus sector. One of them is beautification projects. This is relatively cheap. You tell all of your buses that you have to look new, you have to look clean, you have to have the same paint, etc. And then with beautification projects, you apply the city titles to say, look, we care about public transportation, responding to clean air initiative, right? You apply to those titles to show we're working on this. Second thing you ask all the bus companies to do is to force them, this is violating contract, force them to replace their bus fleet entirely. Now, a regular franchise contract between government and bus firms will be about 20 years. In this contract, it will specify that buses have a lifespan of 8 to 10 years. So after 8 to 10 years, renew them, repair them, do whatever you need to make them safe. That will be in the contract. In this case, local governments will say, we know your bus fleet is barely 5 years old, but now because we have this new initiative, we want you to replace the entire bus fleet into the following. It could be new energy buses, right? Use LPG and LNG fuel back then in the 2000s, even though the engines were not compatible, and even though the Chinese government has not been supplying facilities such as charging stations for these new fuel. They would just go to the bus firms and say, do it, change your fuel. The other things will follow naturally. Second thing they want Chinese bus companies to do is to say, okay, regular buses are 8 meters long, but now we want to encourage people to take buses, change them into 12-meter long buses, change them into high capacity buses, so that we can tell Beijing that more people are taking these buses, right? And third one is just aesthetically pleasing. So a lot of retro bus, Q buses showed up in China. So let me show you what some of these look like. That will be new LPG buses. When the bus companies don't have other facilities support using LPG, but already changed the fuel. But in this case, visibility project here actually evolved into real developmental projects in 15 years, when all of the facilities finally caught up to using LPG. And this is a high capacity bus. This thing is called a straddling bus. This was a 2016 bus experiment. So what you're seeing here, at the top of this bus, this is a huge monster thing. At the top of it, you have this huge bus body that could accommodate 1,000 passengers at the same time. Underneath the bus, it will be hollow. So the concept is it will carry a lot of people, but it's not going to obstruct traffic. Regular vehicles could drive underneath these giant buses. 2 hiccups. One, this bus on the track could only move in a straight line. It's extremely difficult for it to make a turn. It would require a street that is 120 meters wide to make a turn. So eventually got stuck in a straight line. 2, it turns out regular cars, once they got under the belly, they couldn't come out easily. They just got stuck, which is really creating more trouble to the traffic. And so this straddling bus experiment, paid by the government and the bus company, quickly got aborted. Third type visibility projects will be BRT. So this is bus rapid transit system. The concept originated in Latin America. Now, absolutely valid urban planning concept, right? This will be enclosed dedicated bus lanes in the city with priority to buses. Right? We have that in DC actually in some sections. Absolutely valid. The issue is because to build the BRT, you have to basically disrupt the current traffic pattern. It needs careful planning. In Latin American cities, usually the planning would take almost 3 years and then construction. In China, guess how quickly can the Chinese city government launch a whole new BRT project? So this, we are talking about the engineering speed of China, 8 months. Now, what happens when you have such a complicated traffic pattern launched in 8 months? This is what we see. Built in 23 cities, and 14 of them reported worse traffic congestion afterwards, and 5 of them demolished the entire BRT project within 5 years. So this is the cost of when you pursue visibility and scale without doing careful planning. And the interesting outcome here is, with the rise of all of these visibility projects in the bus sector, and this is nationwide, we start to see private companies leaving the sector. Most of them are coerced out of the sector. So this is the pattern of bus companies in China. At the end of 2016, how many cities, which will be the white area, how many of them will still have private bus companies left? Very few. So how did this happen? So I did a quantitative analysis. I wouldn't bore you with the details, but basically the pattern goes like this. Let me first show you how quickly all of these projects kill off private companies. Where you're seeing here survival analysis, let's consider the end result to be death, right? When they crash. So this is how many cities would still have private bus left in the city at the end of 15 years. Now, if you have zero visibility project launch in your city, this will be the line on the top. Consider that natural death of the private bus sector. Maybe private companies are out of business because of subway and other traffic modes, right? But once a city government started to launch visibility projects based on its frequency, so 1 project every year, 2 project every year, 3 project every 3 years, etc., you will see that with the higher the frequency of visibility projects, quicker the death of the private sector. It just crashes the private economy in this sector. And why is that the case? So I have process tracing in this book that I wouldn't bore you with, but basically, almost universally, in my 15 cities example, the process goes like this. All the bus firms will be asked to contribute to all 3 projects in the sector. And at first, all of them will agree. They know that their business depends on their relationship with the local government. But then costs will rise with more visibility projects show up. And then all of them, private and state-owned enterprises, would resist. And this is when government started to exercise coercion. There are many ways to coerce business in China, make them listen. There's a very complicated tax institution that almost nobody could understand fully or obey fully. So it's almost always true to catch, you can always catch a company with tax fraud. You can catch them with a lot of other things, register capital requirement, environmental standards, safety standard, many ways. These business, they do violate laws and rules in China. Now, government exercise coercion, and then you will see bus companies would cave to it for a brief period of time. Visibility projects continue. But then costs continue to rise, and this is when firm ownership comes in to play a difference. Private firms with their hard budget constraint, they cannot easily get loans from banks. They cannot get bailed out by the government. They eventually couldn't afford it, so they resist. And one of the resistance is to sue the city governments to a court. State-owned enterprise do not need to do that. They have soft budget constraint. They always get loans, they get bailed out. So they will voice their support for the private firms, but they will not do anything. Now, when you resist and the city government needs these visibility projects to go on, and they need to get rid of these very bugging private enterprises, you will see deprivatization happen in the city. So this is a very common story of bus sector in China. However, that being said, I should end this very quickly. I'll just quickly tell you the second political service. That being said, it's not true that political services always render business, a victim to the state. It really depends on the nature of political services. So this is second political service, societal control. I'll just quickly show you pictures and I'll just tell you what happens here. In many sectors, there will be controversial projects that will invite protests for sure. The NIMBY protest, now in my backyard. We're talking about nuclear plants, we're talking about chemical factories, paper manufacturing, and waste incineration. Now, what I discovered in China is that The Chinese government, right, they really don't like to be the target of protest. Now, this is an authoritarian state. You must preserve your legitimacy. When protests happen, the government would say, this is not us, even though a lot of these projects are, co-operated project between government and business. They will say it's all the company's fault. Now, when you face protesters, you have two approaches to them. One is appeasement. You basically give them money. You buy them off. Where does the money come from? You go to the company that is polluting the environment. You say, we're going to fine you, a heavy fine. And then this fine, part of them will go to the public to appease them. And then also, we're going to put you on a platter. We'll tell the public, we want you to upgrade and renew all of your facilities. We're going to have heavier regulation and monitoring on your behavior. You need to be clean, and we need to promise to the public that you are being clean. Okay, this is appeasement. In the appeasement strategy, what the government really is looking for is a scapegoat, right? The business will be the scapegoat. Now, we're not talking about they're innocent. They are polluting, right? But in this case, government will say, we're going to send you to the public and you're going to pay the fine. Now, exchange, we want to thank you for being a scapegoat. When we say we want you to upgrade and renew your facilities, we're going to keep half close our eyes, keep a blind eye on that. Once the public receives money, once they become, they accept this money and accept your existence, we're going to pay back. You can go do your cost-saving measures. So this is a very much state business collusion in using business as appeasement strategy. However, for some kind of projects, for example, nuclear plant or large polluting plants, money doesn't work. The public will say, we're not going to take your money. We want this project gone. In that case, what would the Chinese local government do? They will have to use violence, and they don't mind use violence, right? This will be police, semi-force police. But here's the trick about using violence. You better be careful about what kind of business you're protecting with violence. You need a state-owned enterprise on your side, particularly if you work with a large SOE in China whose project is inducing political protest. As a local government official, you get forgiven by Beijing. Beijing will say, okay, this project is making the public unhappy, but because this project is done by a large Chinese SOE, we'll be on the SOE side. We're not going to blame anyone in the SOE or in local government. And then you can go around and use violence. And so in very controversial sectors, Chinese local government make careful calculation on who to work with. If they believe money could buy off protesters, they're going to favor private enterprises. And this is private enterprises' opportunity in the sector. But if they believe money doesn't work, you have to resort to violence. You'd better work with a large SOE. So in sectors with different protest level, and when protests develop into different trajectories, we see company landscape change in this kind of sector. And one takeaway of this kind of political service is protests do not change the outcome of what the public wants. It only changes company landscapes. It does not really change the outcome of projects. So this is second political service that I saw. Very quickly in concluding remarks. Now, from the company's perspective, how do they view political services? Do they like it? In general, compared to classic, business activities such as lobbying, such association, such as even corruption, they prefer all of those to political services, particularly in an authoritarian state. Because when it comes to this kind of political services, companies have little control over almost all aspects. Who are these political services benefiting? Not necessarily the politician you need, right? How much do they cost? The cost is outside of company control. It's not like corruption. There's no market price. The price is set up by the political system. When would these political services happen? You also don't have control. It doesn't necessarily happen when you need, a particular timing in regulation and licensing. It happens based on politicians' promotion clock. So companies have almost no control over all aspects of political services, rendering them the weaker side in the bargain. They might not eventually benefit from them. So companies really don't like providing this kind of political services. Therefore, when political services rise in a sector or in a locality, we start to see a lot of the times private capital is going to exit. And this explains a lot of the times when we see an exodus of investment out of a sector. A lot of the times it's a political story. So this is a very interesting outcome that I observed. And the second thing is foreign companies, okay, where do they stand in providing political services in China? My observation is, in general, they are weaker than other Chinese companies. One, they simply don't harder for them to understand the political services, and much harder for them to take uncontrollable costs to contribute to Chinese officials. And therefore, in a sector that is politicized, foreign companies are usually the first ones to exit. And then last, what does this mean for Chinese companies when they go abroad? And this is very much related to the second book that I'm working right now in South America. When they go abroad, they realize that their cost in productivity and business activities are changing rapidly. Now, if we think about Chinese advantage, right, company advantage when they go abroad, a lot of times it's low cost. Now, what is that low cost? Where does that come from? In China, the cost is usually quite low in both labor and environment and in safety standards. When Chinese companies go abroad in mining, manufacturing, etc., they suddenly realize costs on these fronts are rising, particularly if you go to a country like, say, Chile, right, where rule of law is very strong. These costs are high. But on the other hand, if these Chinese companies are used to very high political costs in China, when they go abroad into a better rule of law environment, they realize that political costs are actually dropping. So they welcome that. And they quickly adapt to a different behavior in dealing with a host country government. So this is very interesting seeing where, in what kind of environment do they change, how they balance all of these costs. And at last, back to this talk, the end of it, I'll show you the first quote in the book. Researching for this book has left me pretty pessimistic about investment environment in China, where politics is such a salient feature. So I'm going to end this talk with the first quote. Economy is secondary to politics in this country. We will give up economic growth without hesitation for political needs. And this was the teaching from CCP Central in Beijing in 2015. Probably stays true all the way to today. So I'm going to end it here. A little bit over time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry for being late. I mean, the book is extremely interesting. I think, I mean, for those of us that do not know China, do not understand how, I mean, the interaction between the private sector and the Chinese government and local government works. I think it's a great introduction. It's a great study, and I mean, you also see a lot of traits that are present in many countries in the world, no, and even more so now. So when your capacity to redistribute or to make policy through the normal instruments that a government has available, then they start using the balance sheet and the instruments that the private sector has, no, and you see that in Latin America as well. However, I mean, the chart that you have, I think, is chart 4.1 that you put here when you see how the intensity of private bus lines in Chinese cities, how they rise and then how they fall. I mean, it's impressive. But and you told the story here. However, I mean, then you start thinking of things that China has done right, like solar panels. Is the solar panel story similar that the government had a strategy? Was it deployed through local governments as well or not? But it ended up being a success. Here it is kind of, you have a federal government or a national government directive, a short horizon of local politicians. So they really don't care about completely absorbing the capital of private firms with the aim of fulfilling the orders from the center, and then they have to nationalize the firm, no? But in other areas, that experimentation, that push and that aggressiveness actually played out relatively well, and technological advancements made up for maybe myopic business decision forced by the political objectives. No, so overall, how do you see, or there's a very clear difference between sectors where you can export your way out, vis-a-vis service sectors where you don't have that that capacity and that scale possibility, etc. I don't know, but it makes you think, because people, I mean, you start seeing Chinese EVs all over the world now. the solar panel story, etc. And you say, well, maybe it was a similar story. In some sectors it plays out, in other sectors it doesn't play out. Maybe for the national government, the experimentation side and the portfolio approach, let's look at it from like a private equity firm, and they say, well, we have significant successes, a few failures, and this policy actually it makes a lot of sense, or they are actually really thinking, look, this policy has excessive costs, and look, in a way, you don't understand how a national government cannot stop that bridge that you showed us being built, given that there was a possibility of having a tunnel. Sometimes you tend to think visibility projects might make a lot of sense in a more democratic sense, because voters do not understand really well the nature of the social return of the project. So you have to make projects visible, no? However, if you're trying to showcase your projects to the National Communist Party, they have the ability of analyzing the project, no? So that also made me think about what I was missing when I saw that. Another question on the private sector side is, do Chinese firms pay excessive dividends? Because given that you have this uncertainty that can actually get rid of your firm at any moment, you will try to extract as much value to the firm whenever you can. And therefore, you might think that private sector firms will pay abnormal dividends because you should get your money out when you can, no? That was something, and then you started talking about this question: is there, how does the government and the private sector interact in terms of the internalization of Chinese firms? I mean, you talked a little bit about how do firms adapt when they arrive, especially in South America, but to go there, are they going there by themselves? Is there also a national prerogative to do it, and then they are following that? Who's doing that? The local governments as well, or is the national government? How does it play out? But overall, I thought it was a great read, and I think it's a very interesting. I think everybody should read it. It's informative. It's analytically well done, and I think the book also presents very interesting examples, stories, and this mix between the analytical work and the interviews. I thought it came out really well. So also looking forward to your next book.
Thank you so much. That's very generous and comprehensive review. I don't know, should I respond, or should we?
Other questions, so we don't.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Ning. Thank you for this. I just have a quick question exactly from the graph on the buses. Is this Xi Jinping story too? Like Beijing goes crazy and then local governments go crazy too? I mean, therefore, I don't know how much it was before versus after. Is there some change there? And the second one is, I think what Alejandro was saying, this seems like an unsustainable pattern where, like, where is this heading to? Like, ways, either something's missing or this is just a quick road to precipice of some type, economic, environmental, etc.
And I think going on the vein of visibility projects, we don't only see local cadres or local governments making those visibility projects, but also nationwide projects such as the Hong Kong-Zhuhai Macau Bridge, the Xiong'an district in suburban Beijing, as well as Dishui Lake, which are projects that like resulted in the creation of ghost towns or underutilization. Xi Jinping has no higher rank to achieve. So what is the central government's considerations and incentives in launching those big, costly, and futile visibility projects?
Thank you. It's a great set of questions. So I'll start with the questions that Alejandro may ask, which is Jenny also mentioned that, is this a route to potential development? Could there be success stories, right? Exactly as you mentioned, EV is one of them, solar panels, wind turbines, right? Seems to have a similar pattern. And I would say in some of these sectors, they began off as visibility projects. Yes, like solar panel, I very much saw how local governments and business have a total common interest. Solar panel shows scale, local business can go abroad. So I think there are several layers to this. One is sometimes visibility projects morph into development projects. And in my book, I try to contrast them and then tell when would they happen? When can visibility projects morph into development projects? Most importantly is when the top-down and bottom-up demand are consistent here. The comparative advantage of a locality, of a sector, is actually utilizing visibility projects. And second, is this a good route to think about development, right? All of the local government officials, whatever incentive they have to start forcing resources in the sector, it sometimes works, but it fails miserably in many other sectors. And even in sectors that it succeeded, like solar panel again, right? The cost, the opportunity cost was enormous. Think about all of the state subsidy goes into it. Think about how many businesses have been operating under, lack of efficiency standard. And eventually they got, just wind out of the sector. That opportunity cost is so big that it makes me wonder, is this really a good route to go for development? I don't know in long term, right? Also, so third thing is, in this kind of sector still, we look at China today, battery might be the one exception where technology and efficiency, right, in China is genuinely high. But in solar panel and wind turbine, the advantage is still in price, which is related to efficiency. Part of it is how do you use technology more efficiently? Part of it is management cost, labor, safety, and environment. So that kind of advantage, I wonder, are those the end goal of development? So I wonder about these questions. But I do agree that sometimes when we see state resources go into a sector in China, sometimes it succeeds. My question is at what cost? And is this replicable? If we want, for example, if Brazil wants to develop a very important sector, if India wants to, should they or could they use the Chinese model of doing it? So I wonder about that. And then, yes, so private firms, do they pay excessive dividends? That's a great question. I would love to see data. My intuition and, data points, random data points, is they absolutely do. They do business sometimes as if there was no tomorrow in China. Like partly it's because they're very afraid of what might change in the sector. It's this kind of institutional environment and market economy breeds short-term vision, is my observation, both in government officials and in business behavior. Absolutely, I think. And I think that's partly that's related to also lack of property rights protection. That's part of why genuine bottom-up innovation is so difficult to reach in China. It takes a long time. Nobody could afford that long time horizon. So that's absolutely, I agree with that, concur with that observation. Jenny's question on, is this a Xi Jinping story? Many other sectors, so bus sector actually overlaps both before and after Xi Jinping. So it's kind of half a Xi story, not quite. And there are many sectors have the same pattern before Xi Jinping showed up. My observation is politicization by sector and how that kicks out private companies has been always a pattern in China's political economy, which is more concerning, frankly, than it's institutional, it's systematic. And then, yes, national. I wonder about that. Because Chinese companies, when they go abroad, they also do visibility projects. Oh, this actually relates to Alejandro's question on visibility projects in democracies. But first on Xi Jinping, I will have no doubt that he wants also prestige. He had nobody else he has future generations of Chinese to remember him by. And if you have a signature project, and this is very typical of all of the, kings, emperors, right? And authoritarian leaders. If you look at interesting national monuments and all of these visibility projects, I would recommend look up pictures of Uzbekistan. It's really interesting how many crazily big statues they have all over the country. So part of the incentive will be prestige and my legacy, right? How I will be remembered. But part of it will be also local government officials will hand over very impressive visibility projects to Beijing. Maybe Xi didn't even think of this bridge. A local government official will say, why don't we build this bridge? Everybody benefits. You see I'm competent, you have a legacy project, everybody wins. And he will handpick that project and say, I love this idea. So the system breathes into itself also. In democracy, so I have this is great because I have this paper that's about to come out. Talk about visibility projects difference in authoritarian system and democracy. You're absolutely right, happens in democracies, particularly there are a lot of research on visibility projects in Brazil and in Africa. It turns out they're different than in China in that visibility in democracies, exactly as you mentioned, they look at voters. So they tend to be very small locally, right? And they tend to be things that voters like. So they will be more likely to be public housing, a hospital, right? Even though facilities inside would also be, barren, or a little public park. The key is they have to be what voters like. And second is because you're only thinking about your local constituency, you're not competing with the next city. You don't need to build the biggest park ever in your country. So visibility project scale is naturally restrained in a democracy. But in an authoritarian state, when you're thinking about your upper level, you're competing with similar projects elsewhere, which creates tons of waste. So that will be one difference. How big they are, how wasteful they are is one. And the second is in what sectors would they show up? Like I don't know how likely will we see, for example, a bridge over a tunnel in Brazil. I wonder if Brazil will ever have the largest transformer statue in the world. And if you go to China, there are tons of the biggest in the world, the longest in the world. That's a thing in China. And I don't think that's naturally a thing in democracies. That's my observation. But yeah, that would be my response so far.
No, my question was more that, and you answer it in your previous answer, saying, look, I mean, to some extent, the visibility project should be aligned also with some visibility interests from the national government. And in that sense, it plays a role in generating a legacy, an image, etc., both from the local level government and from the national government. However, when it's only to send a signal to the national authorities, you would tend to think that they would have the capabilities and the methodologies to judge good projects or excessively irrational projects. And those should be punishable by a federal authority. So that was a little bit my sense, but you answered it saying, well, maybe also Xi Jinping wanted this bridge to be built. So he wants to show to the whole country that China and to the world it's able to do these things, no?
Got it. Yes. So I would say both parts. The national government actually gets very annoyed about visibility projects. The issue is they're always behind because visibility projects engage with vague directives. Beijing didn't know yet what is worth doing and what is not worth doing. For a period of time, they will have to watch and realize this project is useless. So they're always 1 to 2 steps behind. But then they will come out and condemn them and say, don't do it again. And all of the local government officials are like, fine, we'll move to a different sector. So visibility projects is almost like a cat and mouse game between the central government and the local government.
Nobody else has any question? No, that goes to this book that everybody was reading here, I think called Breakneck, that says that China has a lot of engineers and the US has too many lawyers, and that's pretty bad for development and growth, etc. And I think your book puts a little bit of cold water into that idea, because that whole approach of showcasing your engineer capabilities and project implementation capabilities, etc., has also led to a lot of waste. While in the US, I mean, you have that other book, Abundance, no, saying that, I mean, we put regulation over regulation over regulation and lawyers checking that the regulations are complied with, etc., then we don't do anything. But also those regulations are there to avoid some of the extreme bad examples that we're seeing also in China, no? And in that sense, I thought it was a pretty interesting counterbalance to that argument.
Just one last point. I think one of the things on the bureaucratic side is that the bureaucracy, the fact that you said that ambiguity in what your mandate is, often creates results of overdoing it. So there's a historical paper on why the Holocaust and Hitler worked, because the mandate was ambiguous. So local officials under the Third Reich overdid it. So because they wanted, again, the promotion and the et cetera. So maybe looking at that bureaucratic aspect of China's system would work. Yeah.
So Ending. Thank you very much for the presentation. And we really looking forward and heard about your research in South America. We're looking forward to that second.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your support and thank you for coming amid all of the snow and ice. Thank you.